Well, you may wonder why I'm dressed like St. Francis. The feast day of St. Francis is October 4th. He passed back in the 1200s on October 3rd. And so the 4th is his feast day. And there are multiple people, as I was growing up as a teenager, that were major influences in my life. Sigmund Freud, Thomas Aquinas, Camus, the French existentialist writer, Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus, Jimi Hendrix, the psychedelic musician, Ginger Baker, the drummer for Cream, and St. Francis. These were major influences in my life as I was growing up. It's an eclectic team. And what attracted me to St. Francis was his commitment to simplicity, his commitment to the earth and to creation, his commitment to knowing his connection with everything that is living, his connection with all of life, and seeing the presence of God in all of life. He wrote a song that talks about brother sun, sister moon, and about the animals, his canticle. He has a prayer that starts like this: Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. That's a great mission statement for our time. He was in the 1200s. And he grew up as a young person that liked to party with his friends. He and his friends would get very involved in things. He had a well-to-do father who was a merchant. So he was called Francesco, which means the Frenchman. His mother was French, his father Italian. Francesco loved to party, loved to get together with other people, and as this adventurous youth, as many youth in his day, at one point he got into the military. This was not a good fit for Francesco. We all try things, right? We try things and see, does this fit? And he ended up being captured. He was put in jail for a long time. And that certainly had an effect on his life, as well as sickness that occurred. And he began reflecting on the meaning of his life, that his life was obviously more than just partying and reveling with his friends. He began to take on a more serious nature as he would hear the words of the gospel read in the Mass. He would hear about Jesus and hear about his life of simplicity and his life of love and service to others. And he wanted to imitate that life. He was assisting his father in selling fabrics. And so there was a beggar that came up to St. Francis, and at the end of the day, all the money that St. Francis had accumulated from selling his father's fabrics, all the money he gave to the beggar. How do you think that went over with his father? Not so good. So, the father derided him. Francesco's friends made fun of him. They said, "You're crazy." But he continued to have this desire to help the poor. That included ministry to lepers. People with leprosy were avoided. But St. Francis, in his life, began to seek them out. But before he got to that point, his father was really disappointed in him because his father wanted him to grow up to be a good businessman. How are you going to be a good businessman if you're giving away your profits to the poor? Yes. How are you going to be a good businessman if you're wanting to imitate the life of Jesus and you're wanting to take on this life of simplicity? His father was very frustrated with him. And on one occasion, Francesco was sitting in a small chapel in San Damiano Chapel. And the chapel was kind of in ruins. There was a crucifix in there. And the figure of Jesus was on the cross. And as Francesco was in prayer and meditation in the chapel, Jesus came to life for him on the cross and spoke to Francesco. Said, Francesco, rebuild my church that is in ruins. Now, initially, St. Francis took that very literal. Like, oh, okay, this chapel is in ruins, and there were other chapels in ruin. And so Francesco wanted to rebuild these chapels. Later on, it became more understandable that the Catholic Church at that time had fallen into materialism, corruption, lots of different things. So not just this chapel was crumbling, but the church was crumbling. So Francesco, wanting to rebuild the chapel, got his father's fabrics and sold them. Hi, you want to talk to me? Oh. And he sold all these fabrics of his father's to get money to rebuild the chapel. And so he collected this money, and then he went to a person who sold stones. And he gave him the money, and when the man understood that this came from the profits of selling all of his father's things without the father's permission, he said, no, I will not sell them to you. Francesco was upset and threw the coins down on the floor, which then the father was given back those coins. And the father wasn't just pleased with his son that, oh, you're so thoughtful, you're so generous. No. He beat his son, and he locked him up in a small, confined area for a long period of time, thinking that might straighten him out. Straighten him out from this silly notion that somehow what happens to a poor beggar affects him. Insane. The insanity of thinking that how we treat creation and how we treat other creatures is somehow linked to him. How insane. Eventually, the father became so upset and frustrated, he brought him to the bishop. When you don't know what else to do, sometimes people turn to the preacher. Can you straighten out this son of mine, So he brought his son, and actually it was kind of a formal thing. He wanted to disinherit his son. It was actually a formal proceeding. He wanted to disinherit his son from receiving any of his inheritance. So he brought him before the city people, brought him before the bishop. He explained to the bishop what a rebellious, disobedient, out of control madman his son had become. He used to party. He used to engage in profitable merchandise. And now he says he wants to imitate the life of Jesus, and he's gone nuts. So, what did St. Francis do? He took off all of his clothes that had come to him from his father. He handed, from the city people, handed them back to his father and said, "Father, here is everything you gave me. I now give it back to you." And he began a renounced life. Someone gave him a tunic somewhat like this, made out of wool. I chose not to wear wool. And, a simple rope with 3 knots could represent the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or the 3 vows that many in the renounced life take of obedience, poverty, and chastity. And St. Francis began rebuilding these chapels, began doing this ministry, and he would talk to people. He would talk to people about the life and teachings of Jesus, and people began following him. This guy who didn't want to own anything, people began to follow him. I've wondered about that. Why did they want to follow him? I think one of the things was that they could see the sincerity, and they wanted a life that somehow transcended the material notion that we're just here to take and to get what we can. I want to share with you a passage of Scripture from the 1st chapter of Genesis. This comes from a translation called The Voice. This is speaking of Adam and Eve. Then God blessed them and gave them this directive: be fruitful and multiply. Populate the earth. That part we haven't had too much trouble with. I make you trustees of my estate, so care for my creation. A trustee, what is it? We have a board of trustees here, a wonderful, wonderful group of trustees. A trustee is someone in whom we have placed a lot of trust. Like the board of trustees, we've placed into their hands the trust of the church. We trust you with the affairs of this church. That's a big trust. We're trustees. We are trustees of the entire planet. God didn't place us here so that we could rape the earth. God didn't place us here so that we can do whatever we want to the water, to the sky, to animals, to whatever. That isn't it. God placed us here as trustees to care for the creation. How are we doing with that? If you wonder what is yours to do, here's one thing. As part of what we're here to do, I want to share with you from the Bhagavad Gita, one of my favorite books. A true yogi. A yogi is a disciple. That is, they've taken upon themselves a yoga, a discipline. So they're a student, a disciple. A true yogi observes me, God, Krishna. A true yogi observes me in all beings. All beings. All beings. And also sees every being in me. Indeed, the self-realized one sees me everywhere. Wherever we go, God is. So we know that wherever we are in the presence of God. There was a song from my childhood that came back to me this morning, and sometimes these hymns come back to me. These hymns that, I would sing as a child. And one of these hymns we would sing over and over and over. And as a child, I thought, why do we sing this song over and over and over? And I'm so grateful we did. This particular hymn, I don't know if any of you grew up with hymns. This is my Father's world. And I remember thinking, this is my Father's world. Sometimes, even in the tradition that I grew up in, the tradition that taught me that song, sometimes that tradition taught me that the world was evil. So see little Timmy in Sunday school. If the world is evil, how is it our Father's world? That song made a definite impression on me. That we're entrusted with something very important here. All the life, I remember as a child, and I loved my father. He loved me. But as a teenager, I wouldn't even smash a spider. He'd get so mad at me. I'd want to capture it and take it outside. Because I thought, they're instilling in me this understanding that this is my Father's world. I can't create a spider. Why would I kill it? So even as a teenager, I was working on this stuff. And now, unity does not do guilt. I'm very grateful for that. The Fillmores created it as such. They didn't want there to be requirements. Charles Fillmore, for a long time, didn't want to write any kind of creed or statement of belief. He didn't want people to get locked in. He wanted an open-ended approach to spirituality. He wanted an approach to spirituality that would continue to evolve and grow. He wanted us to grow beyond where he was at. He wanted us to grow beyond knowing that we could heal ourselves. He wanted us to grow beyond believing that we are immortal. He wanted us to grow beyond knowing that we can create this planet in God's image. He wanted us to grow beyond that, and we haven't even caught a glimpse of it. So I'm still trying to catch up with Charles Fillmore. So don't toss him out. First, try to understand him. When I first started going to a Unity church, there was a leader there. He's now passed. His name is Dennis Young. And Dennis and I went out to eat. Went to a special place that he liked to eat. And Dennis explained that he was vegetarian. Now, I had heard the word before, but I had never known one. And I thought, you don't eat meat? No. You don't eat meat at all? No. I thought, how does he live? Oh, my goodness. And during that time, I was reading the works of Charles Fillmore, and not just a few times, hundreds of times. He talks about reverence for animals and not eating animals. I'm like, wow, started having a major influence on me. I became vegetarian. That was my first influence, was unity in becoming vegetarian. Now, we don't require anything, and I'm not here to produce guilt. I am here to teach unity teachings. Now, This morning, everyone, I had several of these books, and I'll get more of them. If anybody would like, I have one more copy that I could give away. This is called The Forgotten Teachings of Charles Fillmore. You know, throughout his books, he talks about respect and love of animals. Bless you. Here's one of his, let's see. Here's one of his statements. I'll just read a couple of them for you. Animals have souls. They are developing, and they create a certain thought atmosphere. As I was up here with Jasmine, and, you know, I'm sitting here, and Lev was gone, and Jasmine came over to me, and I started rubbing Jasmine's head, and then Jasmine laid down at my feet. There was a certain energy, an energy of love, an energy of peace. You can sense the energy of your animal, yeah? And that's true of all animals. So, animals have souls they are developing, and they create a certain thought atmosphere. Let them alone. Thou shalt not kill. The Bible does not say thou shalt not kill man, but thou shalt not kill. We would remember that all life is sacred. It belongs to the one great life. And we have no right to destroy the animals because we lust after meat. This is one of the core teachings of Charles Fillmore. Now, you're not required to believe this. You're not required to believe this as a member or leader in Unity. But I think it is important to think about this. Why did Charles Fillmore emphasize this so strongly? One of the reasons he emphasized it is this. Now, he did believe that in order for us to regenerate our bodies, our spirits, we needed to not eat dead flesh. That's a quote. But he says this: we need never look for universal peace on this earth until men stop killing animals for food. The lust for blood has permeated the race thought. He's talking about the human race. The collective unconscious has permeated the race thought. And the destruction of life will continue to repeat its psychology the world around until men willingly observe the law in all phases of life. Thou shalt not kill. Again, I do not state that to induce guilt. So that's not the purpose. But I do want you to think about it. I do want you to think about, how do we treat our creation? How do we treat our world? Do we recognize the divine in all of creation? Do we see the divine in a bird? Do we hear the divine as I hear in the morning when I hear the birds singing through the window, or sometimes those crows? Ma, ma. Do we hear the divine? When we listen to a rippling brook, do we hear the voice of spirit? When we feel the cool wind on our face in the morning, or feel the warmth of the sun in the afternoon, in the wintertime when we feel the rain, are we feeling God? When we see the person at the bus station that has dirty and torn clothes, are we seeing God? When we see God everywhere, we're never lost, for God is always there. I encourage you to repeat an affirmation after me. I am a trustee of this planet, of creation, of all life. I accept my responsibility. With joy. No guilt, but lots of joy. And so it is. Amen.